Thank you very much for your attendance and attention today. Particularly today, it's been a hard winter and it's a lovely day outside. I can assure you it will be a lovely day inside for the next hour or so. Before I introduce you to our speaker, I want to thank the impresario, not only of this event, but of the colloquy that it keynotes, and that would be Nancy Knock. Nancy is back there. You will meet her briefly. She will come to the microphone toward the end as the reception starts and tell us all where to go. She has earned that right by attending to detail and arranging us so well today. This afternoon's lecture, as I mentioned, keynotes the colloquy on leadership and culture. The colloquy itself is the culmination, some of you know, of the Jepson Issues Forum on culture shock. I want to take an opportunity, just a moment, to thank several of the folks who've made that so immensely successful. Several are here. Shannon is not, but Tammy I saw. Thank you so very much. Kirsten, and of course our colleague Dean Peart, who at the Jepson School makes everything possible, including me. My name is Peter Kaufman and I teach there. I'm not sure she'd own me, but she has me. I want to also thank especially my faculty collaborator through this year of culture shock, collaborator and innovator and stabilizer and trapeze artist, Kristen Bizzaio. Just wave. And now to Katie. Kathryn Lofton is the author of an acclaimed study of Oprah Winfrey, Oprah, the Gospel of an Icon. And Katie connects in that book the humdrum and the humbuggery, the more or less insignificant moments of popular culture, reality TV, soap operas, soap commercials, the things that seem sideshows to most of us in the university. She connects them to our society's most meaningful aspirations. It's a marvelous book. I'm plugging it because afterward, Tim Coates, if you'll raise your hand, is presiding over multiple copies. Katie also connects with her colleagues and students in the departments of history, American Studies, religion, and the Divinity School. She's yet to invade the School of Medicine, where in the last 3 years, Kathryn Lofton was awarded 3 of the most coveted awards for mentoring, interdisciplinary instruction, and flat-out sensational teaching. Katie connects with me because she received her PhD at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where during some stints as my teaching assistant, I am that old, she made sense for grateful undergraduates of my nonsense and humbuggery. And now Katie Lofton connects with you and connects you to the leadership of silence, 20th century cultural icons, and the volume of quiet. Katie Lofton.
No, I was maybe going to embrace you, but then that didn't work out either. I begin this day somewhat intimidated. 2 of my teachers are in the audience tonight, so I will be both wobbly and insecure inside and overconfident outside. W. Clark Gilpin at the University of Chicago and Peter Kaufman are here, who are both teachers of mine and inspirations of the ways in which pedagogy can be both elegant, precise, and carry a student forward with some verve. But now I want to speak briefly about annoyance. When Peter asked me to write this talk, he set a frame for it that to me is pretty impossible. To a mixed crowd, give an academic talk, something that everyone can access. To me, the word academic and something everyone can access are not exactly two things that go in the same sentence properly. So I tried, as I was preparing my talk, to think about it like a TED Talk. So I even made bullet points. As you know, they always do in TED Talks, where they're like, here are the points you will walk away with. Take them in. It's the last time you'll see them. So that's not true. I'll put them up at the end. But I was trying to think about how to speak about something that I feel quite in the middle of. The people here who are speaking at a colloquy are thinking about the category of an icon. And I'm in the middle of trying to work that category out. Even though I threw it into a title of a book, it is still an open parentheses for me. So today is going to be a series of thoughts by me about the nature of leadership in particular, given the auspices under which we're speaking, that is the Jepson Institute for Leadership, and I'm going to try to speak about the ways that I see icons telling us something about the nature of a leader. I want to begin by saying that I think it's really hard to be a good leader today. This begins our conversation, which I hope will eventually be a conversation, with a very banal observation. But it feels like such a palpable and true problem. I want to say it, especially to any of you who currently lead or direct or aspire to lead or direct programs, units, divisions, brigades. I don't think the difficulty of leadership is a historically new phenomenon exactly. Gilded Age political candidates experience about as much mockery as any current legislators and governors who have to manage a world now of Colbert and Stewart mockery at every move they make. But no matter its particular newness, it does seem to me that we can't say enough how hard it is to do that well. To be someone of dignity, discipline, and creativity in a time of elaborating bureaucracy and ferocious oversight and pervasive mediation of all experience. So I want to try to begin in all of our minds to conjure for yourselves individually the image of a good leader. Someone who led you in any social unit greater than 10. And you thought as they led you, you do this all right. I want you back. As you multiply the size of a given unit beyond 10, think about if your leader survives. How big of a unit are you thinking of when you think of your good leader? What makes a good leader of multiples, of scores, of companies, states, denominations? The more massive the unit over which someone leads, the more likely our access to them becomes redacted, summary. At my university, for example, we have begun to get notes from our president called Notes from Woodbridge Hall, which is the space where he has his office. And they relate jocular sentiments from him to us. For most of us, this plus a couple ceremonial encounters over the course of a year is the only way that we know the real of our leader. Emailed, newsletters, and a couple ceremonial encounters. Yet nonetheless, we feel his presence, and we attribute his presence all the time multiple effects in our daily experience. We speak quickly upon his inauguration of his particular era, his leadership, his effect. One thing then begins to be sure, a leader is also a symbol of the whole he leads. And it is over the symbolization that so much anxiety emerges. Is he pushing our concept of the university in the right direction? So often our answers that are based on very limited data sets tend to be very cruel, very condemnatory. I'm interested in the spaces between our certitude about whether our leaders are doing well and how little we know about what it really takes to lead institutions. It is that space of unknowing and certitude that I, as a scholar of religion and a student of popular culture, consider myself a very minor expert. the space where certain things like religion and celebrity insert themselves or are inserted to fill the gap between knowing and not knowing. Religions may be detailed and hugely complicated, but they also are bridges between what we think we can know and what seems impossible to know. Celebrities could be, in their reality, really detailed, creative, fascinating, particular, but they are also understood to us only as summaries, rarely as felt, particular human wholes. I see celebrity as playing an increasingly significant role in our religious imaginations, defining and shaping our ethics and our cosmological sensibilities. In the mid-20th century, Daniel Boorstin wryly described the celebrity as a manufactured person. The rapidity with which a person can become, this is his language, a household word overnight was Boorstin's main concern, writing, "The celebrity is born in the daily paper and never loses the mark of his fleeting origin," the mark of that daily paper. It is one thing to erect such figures, Boorstin said, but it is another thing to attach to them any kind of real value. This is a mid-20th century snob of the highest, smartest order. How dare you attach to that overnight success any kind of eminence, since according to his definition, a celebrity is someone not known for X or Y heroism, not known for X or Y talent. No, by his definition, the celebrity is a person who is known for his well-knownness. Continuing his diagnosis, he writes, quite beautifully, "Of course, we do not like to believe that our admiration is focused on a largely synthetic product. Having manufactured our celebrities, having willy-nilly made them our cynosures, the guiding stars of our interests, we are tempted to believe that they are not synthetic at all, that they are somehow still God-made heroes who now abound with a marvelous modern prodigality." It is this attribution of a prodigal capacity to someone sheerly invented that quite intrigues me. I'm looking for seats for you. I think you don't mind coming down front. I'll gesture. How we go from being known just for being known. I don't know why I know her, but she's everywhere. I see her. To being understood as meritorious, as gifted, simply because you are known. So with this very particular strange expertise, that is the conjunction of American religions and American celebrity, I want to think about what it means to lead. And I want to think about if we aren't almost always now cracking our leaders apart before they have begun their work. I want to think in particular if there isn't one particular historical reason that makes leadership today so much harder than before. And that is what I want to call the new erratic expectation. The accessibility of individual self-promotion. You know what I mean, you tweet. And then the resultant pervasive commodification of your individuality has led us to develop whole new sets of hopes and expectations for what we think leaders should be able to do. We think they should be able to be leaders and also signify leadership, to be icons of whatever they lead. And if I have a driving thesis today, it is that this is impossible. Real leadership cannot also be iconic of leadership. Real leadership is brutish. It is quiet. It is humble. It is often discreet. What in this world can be those four things anymore? But I ran ahead of myself a little bit. What I really want to underline is that I've been thinking a lot about leadership, the related ideas of image and estimation. Again, in my home institution, there is a major revision of the decanal structure, which is going to include a new significant administrative position, a dean of faculty, and the replacement of 2 other deans currently in standing. Conversations about who should hold those positions in my local context inevitably lead to a very hard appraisal of their predecessors. Hard talk about very specific, bureaucratic, and charismatic failings. We all know, wherever you work, this kind of grousing, complaining talk. The way that workers can find such a vast vocabulary of criticism when talking about their bosses. Criticism that links very specific aspects of personality with very specific failures of management. We transform a live wire, a real mind, a once-upon departmental colleague, into a kind of celebrity topic, connecting physical traits to personality traits to professional traits. This transformation of the embodied, the material facts of the thing of a person into a spiritual appraisal of them is not new in the history of humanity, though. To be sure, we all know the way that human beings become redactions of themselves, made over into things importantly emblematic. But it seems to me that this transformation of self into icon, icon into irony, you note now he's made up by brand names in the one on the right, that this is a particular plot that I think we even now have superseded. We now live in a time when a certain kind of discipline is the very least you must achieve if you want to survive public appraisal of your person. Everybody now has to develop a particular skill for redaction, for self-summary, for branding, and as I will say, for emptying. Perhaps no celebrity better epitomizes the centrality of physical embodiment, repetitive disciplined appearances, and emptiness than that of Miss Kim Kardashian. Recent outcries over the Vogue cover of she and her fiancé Kanye West, better known as, thank you, demonstrate that the public is contradictory about its relationship to the vacuity of the image. Perhaps you don't know, people were upset by this cover. We want our public figures to be idealized embodiments, but we don't want them to become our public figures merely because of those embodiments. We want something else, something more, some concept of substance lingering beneath the representation of style. Vogue readers, it seems from the reaction, prefer the more nameless high fashion model to Kim Kardashian because Kardashian has made the mistake of confusing her forms of embodiment as being analogous to theirs. Kardashian did the impossible. She, who looks a little bit like a model, but maybe a lot more like us, has confused the iconic space, provoking outcries that sound a little bit like iconoclasm. Sally Promi and David Morgan have written a great deal about iconoclasm. They write, as a strategy, iconoclasm transforms icons into idols and seeks to break the spell the idol has over consciousness. And so the critics of the Kimye cover want to keep it from being iconic and remind anyone who likes it that they have become idol worshipers, suckered by presence, a presence that lacks altogether the proper spirit. There is something about Kanye West and Kim Kardashian that makes people feel they, that is Kimye, just don't quite get it, as if they can't stop mortifying themselves before us with their excess materiality, their excess exposure, their excesses of speech. Critics of the cover appearance perceived a failure of brand control by Miss Anna Wintour, who should have known better than to contradict her imperious stylistic hierarchy with such low idols. Yet the public stands in obvious contradiction, since they also perceive that they, the readers, obviously don't quite get the consumption of Kimye, which is unstoppable, and by the way, best-selling, 350,000 issues and more sold. There is always more images of Kim, more albums by Kanye, more quotations from both of them to fill the space, to fill that break in your lunch hour, to be the soundtrack on your commute, the late-night TV wasteland filled by their images played out. Kimye are fit for a binge culture. What they make, we don't stop consuming. It's not good for me. It's not good for me. Their noise seems to be part of the problem and their solution to it. They are the excess mediation of our time. They are the embarrassment of our time. In early Christian traditions, icons were visual representations of religious figures, either two-dimensional paintings or three-dimensional sculptures. In order to avoid being described as idolatry, icons were understood to be themselves essentially hollow. These early Christian icons were understood to be mere points, redirecting the focus of the viewer towards that which was signified. The icon pushes your gaze towards Jesus, towards Mary, towards a saint. The problem with Kimye is that they don't make it very easy to redirect from their materiality. To what do they direct us to? Of what are they symbolic? Their heroic parallel makes it so much easier. Beyoncé and Jay-Z, we know what they represent. Hard work, black royalty, talent, name it. They're it. But Kimye gives us something else. Their iconicity seems to point only at the signification of their very excess of availability to us. They are, in this sense, icons of the media moment which consumes them. This foray into Kimye serves only to underline what our standards for iconicity are or seem to be. It may seem as if I wandered a bit afield from leadership. But what I want to dig into is the subtle ways we, here the we should be questioned, who we, me we, have differentiate between Kanye and other types of icons and what we expect from our iconography, and how this, in our time, poses very real problems to what it means to be a leader of substance. How can you be substantial when you have two media effects tugging on you? On one side, the scrupulosity police tugging on your every false move for its idiocy and self-contradiction. Tweet, tweet, tweet. On the other, the hungry hordes asking you to communicate, to give, communicate, offer, Instagram, tweet, feed, 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 tweet again. We expect to offer more transparency than ever before. We are expected to be better, smoother, more perfect, and knowledgeable than ever before. What is a humble leader to do? As a reminder, I noted that you can't lead and be an icon. Leadership requires a certain kind of self-abnegation that's impossible to do if you're already articulated as or through the iconic frame. But I still think, even as I say that it's not quite right, or that there still are things to learn about the relationship between icons and leaders that might be usable for the present conversation. So I want to think a little bit more about what icons do in an effort to figure out how laboring leaders, trapped in bureaucracies, might survive their era. To begin, if you want to be an icon, you have to stop speaking and let other people do the talking. This is very, very hard for people who are religious leaders to do. Very few religious leaders can also be icons. Even though many icons become religious objects for the followers, we'll get back to that later. For now, I want to prove to you this particular point, that very few religious leaders become icons. This may not be right because immediately maybe some of you are thinking like, Jesus or Buddha. We're going to get back to both of them too. They're religious leaders and they became iconic. But the leaders I'm talking about are leaders, 20th century, 21st century leaders, very parochial, very few of them being memorable despite large audiences. I'm going to prove this to you through, yes, an interactive exercise. All right, I'm going to offer some images of 20th century religious figures. I chose people who are specifically leaders, that is not just local parishes, but of major churches, founders of new parachurch operations, international evangelists. So, everyone that is going to be about to be shown has been seen by hundreds of thousands of people, okay? And all you have to do is I'm going to put their picture up, and if you feel pretty confident that you know who they are, raise your hand, okay? You got it? If you think you know who they are, you're going to raise your hand. All right, first one. Anyone? Okay, we're starting poor. We got one, we got two. All right, anyone want to shout it out? Salvation Army, Evangeline Booth. We got about 4 or 5 on that situation. Excellent. Yes, 4th General of the American South Salvation Army. All right, anyone want to raise their hand? Okay, I think the same people keep raising their hands, which is demonstrating that there's some American religious historians in the house. Next person. Oh, see, I feel like right now, Dean Gilpin is really showing it up. Okay, anyone, okay, next one. Professor Gilpin's not allowed to speak. So we're going to see what kind of silence falls over this crowd. Who is it? Yeah! Adrian Rogers. Yes, Adrian Rogers, 3-time president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Not Oral Roberts, but good guess, good guess. Old guy, white guy, obviously evangelical. All right, anyone want to give a little drive for this? Good job, Louise Hay! Way to go, okay. Yes, look at all these feelings. Now you're going to Google her later because it just makes you feel good. Don't you feel better? No, it's a little dark, actually. Later we'll talk about it. Benny Hinn, good job. He's a miracle man. Benny Hinn. You know him by the Mandarin tongue. I don't. That is fantastic piece of information, Professor Ariel. In the house. And finally, Calvin Butts III, preacher of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, probably the most significant African-American minister of the last 20 years. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. They know you don't know them. They're doing fine. Now we're going to run through that I feel pretty confident you're going to know. If you know these images, you're going to say the name, okay? You got it? We're on it? All right, now we're in a chorus. Yes. A couple less, but I feel good about it. Yeah! There he is. I think that was the most animated. You'll note that I made a transition between the first three iconic examples, that is Mother Teresa, MLK, Dalai Lama, and the second three. The first three being religiously affiliated icons, and the second three being less obviously religiously demarcated. I think it would be safe to call the second set of those figures celebrities. What I want to press into that transition is the argument I want to make about leadership today, which is to repeat that we live in a time when it's increasingly difficult to be a leader without being held to the standards of celebrity. More shocking, I'm not sure anyone could even be an elected leader anymore without becoming a master of the stagecraft of celebrity. Consider, for example, the February 21st, 2011 issue of Newsweek. And it shows on its cover a picture of actor George Clooney. This is one of my favorite issues of Newsweek. I talk about this cover more than any human being should talk about a cover or anything, because of everything on it. If you take some time and just read all the slogans, you'll have a good time. In any event, this is where he is not promoting any television show or film, any of the many projects he's working on. Instead, he's promoting a geopolitical problem. The article inside begins, as Hollywood scrambles to the final days of jockeying for Oscars, George Clooney's attention is far away, 9,000 miles away to be exact. The Veteran Academy Awards campaigner plans to walk the red carpet and crack open an envelope at Sunday's ceremonies, but he has no movie in contention. A different drama is on his mind. The cover announces that Mr. Clooney, the president, is on line one, directing, yes, the president to Mr. Clooney. The article headlines with a more declarative ascription calling Clooney a 21st century statesman. This back is the article's own language. In January, Clooney was back in South Sudan, directing his star power towards helping its people peacefully achieve independence from the northern government of Khartoum after 2 decades of civil war. No mention, to be clear, of religion is made in the article. If you're waiting for me to drop that, there is no spiritual awakening that brings Clooney here, although they often do bring people to sub-Saharan Africa. Instead, the article infers that Clooney possesses a basic decency inherited from his father, from the secular ethics of his career, and his sense of social responsibility. Indeed, it was the influence of his father that led Clooney to co-write and direct Good Night and Good Luck, a film depiction of Edward R. Murrow's famed face-down of US Senator Eugene McCarthy. Newsweek consistently presents Clooney as a form of responsible rationalism of a pre-infotainment age. He is the celebrity who wields his celebrity to the good beyond celebrity. As the Newsweek journalist explains, in this new environment fueled by social networking, fame is a potent commodity that can have more influence on public debate than many elected officials and even some nation states. As the political necessity of celebrity and celebrity circulation continue to expand, it will be useful to recall that such missionary projects do not merely have their origins in ideologies of secular reason. The power of celebrity to expand and contract, to fit the image of a given moment, and to belong in the crevice of any crisis is not because that image is denuded of meaningful religious authority. Indeed, I would argue their enchantment is precisely their resume. This erratic authority, Clooney staring out at those problems in the Sudan, convincing us somehow that he can solve anything, is not accomplished through a lot of testimony by Clooney himself. Indeed, the sense is that Clooney would precisely disavow such valorization. He'd rather be doing something other than talking about the doing of it. He just wants to be making movies, saving lives, whatever. He just wants to be doing. Icons are, in some sense, muted. A component of their role-specific expectation is that they don't do anything exactly. They just do what we tell them to do. As Robert Manura explained in his essay on the icon, icons have traveled very far from an art historical definition that focuses on the nature of a material object from Eastern Orthodox churches. The more widespread use of iconic seems to draw on this other aspect of its materiality. Here now thinking about the way in which that object is designated to be something of high status, to refer to, as Manura puts it, something that is culturally salient, things like people, things, concepts, culturally salient sports people, musicians, commercial products, brands. Those culturally salient things we know can be so many things. If I say the word icon, you can right away come up with a million examples. Just by looking at books published in the last 5 years, I found out that an icon can be Robert E. Lee. It can be Friedrich Nietzsche. Icons can be companies which transcend the economic odds, like the Rom Corporation. It can be Ford Motor Company, of all things, in the last 5 years, and the Comeback Kid since the crash. It could be paintings which transcend centuries. And it could be works of art or architecture whose sheer outline is instantly recognizable. Of course, cultures too have icons, images which summarize them for us. Individual clothing or consumer packaged goods can be icons, whether it's Coca-Cola or jeans. This history suggesting that it tells the story of America's best loved garment. What each of these companies or items share is some sense that their very figuration conveys the total fact of their invocation. Ford Motor Company is now the Comeback Kid. Japanese swords are the feudal history of Japan. Jeans are the universal garment. The icon is almost always an icon of something, that thing it points to, just like in Lynn Morgan's Icons of Life, a cultural history of human embryos. An icon is a portal to the complex whole, a transom from reality into its heightened maximal articulation. David Morgan has written extensively about icons and their power within visual culture. He writes that an icon is not merely an image, a visual sign, but also something more. He has noted the way that that's something powerful to be noted. And that's something powerful, he says, is that if you look at the construction of an icon, whether it's Mao's portrait, or Jesus' devotional image, John Lennon or Che Guevara, or Marilyn Monroe in a glamour still, he argues that in every case of an icon's presentation, pain, suffering, and violence shape the event of the person's life and the lure he or she exerts among devotees. I agree with Morgan in that figuring of something about the relationship between the iconic and the violent or the suffering. I want to add to this sense a broader profile of the sadness almost always imbued within the iconic. Think of the iconic image, for example, which is almost always sad, picturing a moment of extreme pain or suffering or death. Likewise, if it's not an image of the violence, very often iconic images are of the moment just after violence or of survival from it. When we speak of the iconic, we almost always mean something that is haunted by something, a tough past, a rough break, an awfulness, an endurance within difficulty. Companies that become iconic supersede bankruptcy. People that are iconic either lived in strong misery or articulated the misery of the masses or sometimes died as a result of that misery. They became ours to return to valorize precisely because they seemed to have something to show us about getting over it, getting past it, still being here, no matter what. Barack Obama is perhaps not the first president to be conscious of his iconography, but he is definitely the first president to have become iconic before he was elected. What is intriguing for our purposes, investigating, if you remember, what icons can teach us about leadership, is what a hard time he's had being a leader as he carries on his iconicity. Despite President Obama's repeated promise that he would have an administration that would be the most open and transparent in American history, reporters and government officials frequently say they're very disappointed in his performance in improving access to information. Here I'm not even speaking about political decisions, just talking about access to the White House. David E. Sanger, the veteran chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times, says that this is the most closed, control freak administration I've ever covered. To be sure, the Obama administration, I want to say, they say a lot. They use social media, videos, they have sophisticated websites to provide the public with a lot of information about everything that they do. along with considerable government data that they redact to be more consumable by a public that they are connecting to by the millions on these websites. However, with some important exceptions, most observers feel that the White House discloses too little of the information most needed by the press and the public to hold the administration accountable for its policies and actions. White House officials perhaps predictably object to that characterization, citing statistics that do show that Obama gives more interviews to news and entertainment shows. He goes on Jimmy Fallon, he speaks openly and easily to Oprah, and he does so in a much greater number than any preceding president. Indeed, he has given more interviews than George Bush and Bill Clinton did in both their first administrations combined. Jay Carney, the press secretary, says, the idea that people are shutting up and not leaking to reporters is belied by the facts. I'm going to leave to the Q&A your own sense of the relationship between Obama's pre-presidential incarnation as an icon and his post-election ferocious control over the idea of his transparency. What I want to highlight is the internal sense by the White House, backed up with data, that they are saying more and showing more than any other White House. And I think it's fair to imagine that Obama will be an icon in the years to come, more than Bush or Clinton, whatever their comparative leadership skills may be. Even if you don't like Obama as a president, we know a lot about him. His basketball games, maybe even his smoking, his ferociously disciplined schedule, his relentlessly sanguine attitude. He has maintained his recognizable features even as he has also remained at times incommensurable as a leader. Robert Till has written a great deal about icons and took up particularly the case of Prince, the music star, and whether or not Prince is a meaningful icon. In trying to think through whether or not Prince is such an icon, he writes that the worshiper effectively creates the popular icon. As members of the audience imagine themselves being or possessing a pop star, they are then embodied as larger-than-life characters, godlike beings, possessing the star as they consume them and being possessed themselves by the character of the star. We know that Eastern Orthodox Christians do all kinds of things with their icons. They put flowers on them, they process with them held aloft, they bless them with water, they prostrate themselves before them, they touch them and kiss them. This is all to say that your use as an icon is somewhat beyond your control. To be sure, you can have a relationship with your fans. Justin Bieber has his fans, the Beliebers. Lady Gaga calls hers the Little Monsters, and Beyoncé calls her most hardcore people the Bayhive. But no matter what, the key is that the fans decide who the fans are. An icon cannot make of her fans who she wants. She gets who she gets for reasons she finally cannot fully account. Students of religion know that three of the major founders of religions, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, all played very complex roles in the formation of their own textual traditions. We know Jesus left no writings. All of our knowledge of him comes from followers' accounts. Likewise, although the Quran is a transmission by Muhammad, his voice is not there. We know Muhammad through hadith, the corpus of reports and of deeds and sayings of him recorded by his contemporaries. And the earliest known extended literary account of the life of the Buddha is dated to the 1st century BC, about 500 years after the estimated death of the Buddha. Between the Buddha's death and the first Buddhist scriptures, the Buddha's speech acts were not written down, but were transmitted orally for 500 years. Yet the mark of scriptural authority for Buddhist texts, sutras, is the phrase that begins them, "Thus did I hear," which refers to the purported witnessing, the hearing, of those teachings by his senior disciples. As you might imagine, there are a lot of very scholarly hermeneutical debates about what constituted being Buddha-voiced, literally spoken by him, spoken with his sanction, inspired by his teaching once upon, heard by your great-great-grandfather, inspired by teaching heard second. What I want to identify through this very cursory act of comparative religions is the way that an audience is determinative for iconicity. You can't control this audience. If anything, they decide who you are. And this deciding will have a lot more loyalty to what they need than what you aspire to make of them. As Bing Crosby did put it, every man who likes me sees in me the image of himself. The Bayhive makes a great deal of Beyoncé's every word and every Tumblr post, and as one NPR reporter recently discovered when getting caught in the Bayhive, they will fight ferociously to defend her right interpretation relative to the world, which may seek to criticize her, to misunderstand her, or question their right to protect her place on the pedestal. An undergraduate student with whom I'm currently working, Maya Mayor, did an analysis of Justin Bieber's popularity. And she evaluated an article that predicted that he would not remain popular in the wake of all of his recent troubles, which if you don't know, you can Google them. He had trouble. He was arrested for driving under the influence, reckless driving, driving with an expired license. The Beliebers did not abandon him, Maya found, as Tweedle and Smith, these two analysts, predicted. In fact, Mayor demonstrates that the Beliebers actually got more excited about Justin in the wake of these crimes, rocketing to his defense. Soon after the arrest, the group of people who support him, the Beliebers, developed hashtags that became trending topics on Twitter. I was going to say tweeter, because that's how into it I am. And there were even pictures of Beliebers holding candlelight vigils for his release in Miami. Bad press didn't make the Beliebers go away. His troubles made them stronger. The cultural history of religious icons is a history of this as the central subject. What is this thing you are, despite what you do or don't say to me? Justin Bieber is loved no matter what he says or what he does or how like or unlike Bieber is relative to other celebrities. What is tugging to me as a scholar of religion is that Bieber doesn't seem to be such like an outlier if you study what so many of us in this room study, which is the history of religions. Figures like Joseph Smith or L. Ron Hubbard or Ms. Oprah Winfrey are people who are hated and disliked by significant portions of the population, who can't even understand the portion of the population that doesn't like them, much less understand those weirdos who really like them. This is why one of the main aspects of being an icon is that you are not going to be for everybody. That everybody cannot see who you are to those who do see who you are. That space of hermeneutics of deciding who you are to me provides a major rule to being an icon. That is that what you are is the thing that persists despite your dismissal. The idea that supersedes your perceived mistakes, your cracks, your obvious corruption. Scholars of celebrity cannot decide. Are celebrities like us, or are they not? To go back to Borstein, he writes, "We imitate them as if they were cast in the mold of greatness, yet the celebrity is usually nothing greater than a more publicized version of us." Much later, a journalist reflecting on Ms. Knowles will write, "The thing Beyoncé doesn't understand about all the rumors surrounding her." So Beyoncé, in case you know, is very famous for getting really outraged about false rumors and then doing very strong interventions in the public's misreading of her, to the point where now she is ferociously controlling of her own image and will do these sort of satirical interventions in the public when they think, for example, that she didn't carry her own baby. So she'll make a point in her documentary of demonstrating that indeed she did carry her own baby. This writer refers to this as a somewhat strange reaction by Beyoncé. She writes, "The thing Beyoncé doesn't understand about all the rumors surrounding her is that in the great tradition of storytelling, the thing beyond our grasp and most people's realities is her. Beyoncé is the last to accept what most people think, that she is not like us." So Borstein says that they're like us, or they're reflections of us, and this person says, no, we like them because they're so unlike us. I'll leave that to the Q&A for us to consider. What I know is that most of the icons that I have talked about today can basically teach us that to try to be a leader in a mediated age is trouble. You're not up to it. It's really hard to compete with them, with their denizens making them a site to create new sites about themselves, with their ability with a very two-dimensional frenzy of internet identity. But if there's anything to learn from these examples, it is that whatever the narrative of your leadership may be by those outside its demographic, the story will be powerfully determined by those within. Very often, we mistake mediation as a determination of our story, that the story is the thing, the narrative is what you control. The surface is the surface is the surface. It remains and reigns triumphant over the substance. Icons seem to demonstrate that for us, even as I would argue that they also show us that this is not exactly so. The space between a leader and their followers, between icons and acolytes, celebrities and their fans, is actually much more tougher, complicated, and meaty than that. The space between leadership and those who lead is the space on which we ought to meditate more. Who are you to your boss? Who are you to your pastor? Who are you to your leader? For icons, there is no discrimination. There are fans, there are us, there's not much in between. But in the worlds of the real that we occupy, I hear a lot of people wishing, longing for something different in their worlds. Different students, different colleagues, different readers, broader reach. But the thing that icons know is that there is no aspirational audience. The longing for elsewhere distracts you from the fact of the present. Here they are, the people who you serve, you teach, you extend yourself to. I use this foray into the habits of contemporary celebrity to think about what we might learn about emergent icons among them, and what those forms of iconic emergence can tell us about our capacities or strategies for leadership. I'll conclude again with those terms. Leaders need to reboot in this time and space. Stop worrying about gaming the system, mastering the meeting, and controlling the story. The only control you have is in what you can hear and what you can present of yourself to respond to the inevitable pain you will hear if you really listen. Unlike an icon, a leader has a much riskier job. She has to figure out how to speak back. But before she does, a lot more leaders could benefit from the witness of the silence of the icons, from their own particular genius of absorbing the world's desires, their tears, their longing into their own. Thank you so much for listening. Now I want to talk about Justin Bieber. So we're going to do that right now. That's my plan. So I'm really happy to take up any of this. For me, the challenge here is trying to find something redacted about something so multiple in its embodiment. So in some ways, I think it's helpful to take up particular cases. Justin is certainly one particularly mortifying example, so we could take someone that's richer. So I really welcome questions from any of the topics raised, but also I also welcome my colleagues who are here talking about religious icons to offer their own knowledge to whatever conversation and contradictions to the cases presented. Yeah, oh, sure. So your question was so beautiful. I want to get the phrasing right. That to ask about new spaces and places and kinds of leadership that imagine the collective as more essential to what the configuration of leadership would be doing. And I assume, are you partially thinking about the effects that sort of crowd-sharing technologies might have on formations of communities? And maybe you could speak a little bit more about the kinds of examples that are in your mind as you're, is that, yeah?
Well, one example certainly would be technologies.
Yeah.
Prior to technologies would be the group consciousness as opposed to the individual consciousness. That would have to precede even the technology.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the technology is just another spread of the individual.
Absolutely, yes. You know, it's interesting. Even as you ask that question, I have to be honest. One hears about this. So I hear about this when I read studies of technology, and I have a couple students who are working on projects of hackers that join together in communities and develop new ways of communicating to one another so they can't identify who's speaking. And so I hear about this. It feels so unrealistic to the dailiness that I occupy and witness. It seems inconceivable. This idea of denuding the self certainly seems like something that would be the natural response to the excess of the self. But yes, exactly. So when I think about new forms of leadership, I suppose I think more about new sources and locations for leadership than I do think about the possibility that a collective would come to stand again as a meaningful unit. I was raised in a community for which the language of Marxism, and particularly Trotsky, was very important. And so they would be really happy to imagine that that was coming back. But one of the reasons I study religion is I'm pretty sure it's not going to. But so I guess my response is something like, I can't conceive of it. I can conceive of elections of leaders we have never met except through the internet. I can conceive of YouTube being the only forum for conversation and engagement. I have a harder time imagining the sublimation of, as you say, the ego self. That seems hard to conceive. So I welcome other people who see that as on the horizon. But part of it, I suppose part of what you're also describing in its darkest terms would be some like the end in the matrix. And I suppose that has an appeal, but I also tend to see it as, the fight for, also in the brighter version, is that the fight for the story of individuality and its aspirational hold is very hard to break in the human psychology.
But I don't
Yeah.
put them as a paradox either or.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not pitting one against the other. I'm
Yes.
talking about an emerging balancing
Yes.
of the individual with the group consciousness, not being in place of.
Yes, I hear that. I'll be that you say that feels to me now like that's something to watch and observe. Again, it maybe suggests the sort of student bodies that I've hung around with all my various universities. I cannot imagine, whether it's UNC or Indiana or Yale, any of those students being intrigued by that. That feels not. So if I postulate some future based on them, but maybe they're not a realistic demography. That there's some concept of the space between you and me that is so valuable to preserve, and so what would it mean to break that down? But I think it's really insightful and interesting to think about that as one of the consequences of a certain kind of sharing that would have to be. Yes. But you had a question too.
I was just sort of fascinated when you put up the Kimye cover.
Yeah.
One of the subheadings was the selfie-made model, Kate Upton.
Oh yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little
Right.
bit about this concept of the selfie and the sort of hatred that our culture has for it, despite the fact that the concept of the self-made man, is one of the structuring principles. So why is it okay when it's business pursuits, but not okay when it's celebrity?
Yeah, that's such a beautifully phrased question. So the question is, the question is to differentiate between, she's pointing out that one of the identities on the cover is Kate Upton, who you may, I don't know, I'm trying to think of context. I suppose her most famous work is being a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. But for people within the media culture, because I think it's not as well, I think there's like two spaces of information sharing. There are clusters, and I've seen maps of this on Gawker. There's clusters of people for whom blogs and talking about the nature of blogs is a whole site of information and caring. I think that there's a whole vast other public for whom those BuzzFeed and Flavor Wire are unknown to them. So I think the selfie-made model, Kate Upton, is in a very narrow culture of people consuming the making of the subject, in which case she, in addition to her more kind of broad swale appeal to this, the differentiation matters to me because I want to say something about the way in which I think the Kardashians are obviously not successful among that media consumptive and analyzing blogging elite. That's where they actually collapse and fail and are mocked. But there's another public that quite grabs onto them and produces all kinds of sites in their honor. Similarly, Kate Upton, her fame is largely through kind of her own physicality and athleticism, but she also was really famous for doing a lot of selfies early in her career and has taught other models. That's one of the key ways to get photographers to know the multiple looks you can produce and your various character attributes. And so your question, though, which is more interesting than Kate Upton for sure, is about why are we so kind of frustrated by, and maybe there's a sort of critique of selfie culture. At the same time, we have a very high praise for the self-made person in this society. Is that a good? Yeah. Okay. And I would say that there are two different imaginations of where that person, that subject is going. The selfie, here I welcome your own thoughts, but my own sense is that when people see a selfie, they think of that person looking back and forth and falling back into the self. And when they think of a self-made man, they think of someone who got up, got out, and gave over, and made into the world. And the self-made man, a 19th century subject who emerges out of a tale of economic suffering, Horatio Alger pulls in order to be a service to the community, to join the concept of community and elaborate it. And the selfie, it seems as if that is the only form of articulation available, is this, and not looking at it. It's precisely the image, or at least the images I see getting the strongest reactions on, like, the UK Daily News, are the images of literally watching people adjust the photo of themselves, and you can, if the photographer catches it right, you can watch them preparing the photo of themselves, so that the only subject of interest, as opposed to the imagination, the alternative being the non-selfie, I put my arm around a friend and I let you take over the discernment of me. And so I'm not falling back into my own understanding. I allow the public to start taking over the creation of myself. So I think it's that, some notion of such primal narcissism. I welcome anyone who is under the age of 25 to speak to this subject, since you are precisely the demographic everyone is so anxious about, the results of all of the staring in the reflective mirror of your iPhone. And you may not feel safe to do that, but I welcome it, because I tend to think any claims by people over 25 of the disaster of the generation to come will quickly seem to be hilarious, because we've said that about every generation of person sitting in this room. You were a disaster. And so now we think this one is a disaster, because instead of televisions, you remember in the 50s, those televisions that were going to destroy your brains, and maybe they did. But we don't know, because Grandpa's not here anymore to tell us why. So now it's the selfie that's sort of immolating us. So one worries about, I think the thing I wanted to make the point technologically in this piece was the sense of the immediacy of accountability. And that for me feels like a different thing, at least the leaders that I am aware of or I feel close to. And whether it's just that all of us have experienced this, whatever job you have is, the relay of information is not, I get a memo, I get an email, and then within 8 minutes there can be 32 more emails tacking on to that particular small thing where your boss figured out, hey guys, I'll take you to lunch on Friday, you'll just have to stay an extra half hour later. And there's 32 emails of, voluminous reply. So what does it mean to be a leader in a time where your ability to have a a sort of shortly reflective reply becomes a part of the public that makes that leader? And I think that this is where we see also a kind of redaction and a sort of, the making of the taupe leader, as one of the people I read spoke about it. Tracy, you had a question.
Yes. Thank you, Amy. I was really struck by the connection you draw between the icon and violence and pain, and I think that that's a very brilliant, compelling link. That what we get when we see Jackie Kennedy or Martin Luther King is not only a beautiful woman, a charismatic man, but a kind of uniformity of feeling that surrounds that person. However we felt, or our parents felt about the Kennedys or Martin Luther King, we know what it's like to lose someone in whom we invested our love, our fantasies, in whom we invested a great deal of power. And I'm thinking, maybe that's why icons don't leave, because the temporality of grief is very different from the temporality of progress. The grief is kind of a pause.
Yes.
Stop. So I'm just wondering if you want to think or say anything to us about the difference between an icon and a brand.
Yeah.
Che Guevara seems a little jarring now. He was made of a brand.
Yeah.
Brands are different from although maybe he has been a brand. The brands are different from icons in that sense. That in the icon, the pain or the suffering supersedes the politics, and in the brand, maybe the brand supersedes the sense of suffering or loss. So.
Yeah, so I'll say too. So Tracy's question, I will have a hard time re-summarizing it, but she just wanted to make a further observation about the nature of grief that using David Morgan's observation about iconic faces being almost always sad faces, and then my own interest is more sort of iconic photography being almost always images of some form of violence or its aftershock. And then what you want me to prompt to think about is the relationship between that and then the jump to the branding of those images in the case of, because it's easy to think of, I make this comment about Ford Motor Company now with the image of the comeback kid. My guess is for most of you that's not the image of Ford. Ford is an icon of, what do you want to say? When we think of a Ford, what do you think? Pinto, that's so funny and cruel. So you think lousy car, a Pinto. Okay, so that's in my house, like the Ford is a lousy car that you want to grow out of so you can buy a Toyota. But there's also an image of, I think self-made manhood, that the origin of Ford is this, racist, anti-Semitic, but a company that, assembled Americans in these assembly lines and made possible the end of unions, actually. But anyway, so largely the iconography of Ford is one of just cars manufacturing, Detroit, and now they try to retake that brand, and when you try to give it a sad story, it doesn't quite stick to it exactly, because whatever Ford is, it won't. And this is where I think, the emergence of the selfie, the person as brand, that locution, when I wrote another paper about this, that the locution to brand yourself has such a recent history. Does anyone want to guess what year that brand yourself first was used? Do you want to take a guess at that? No, it was 2002. 2002. So if you think about that, brand yourself and make yourself a brand. So the selfie as a formation of the self, one assumes a kind of idealized, redacted portrait. And then the expansion of corporate power in our life, which is such a bromide, I hate to say it. We always say it's like the expansion of corporate power in our life. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is the ways in which we both know that there are fewer and fewer businesses with 50 or fewer operators run in this country. We know that the form of conglomerate consumer packaged goods stores is the future, that whether it be Amazon.com online or Walmart, both of which are forms of conglomerate purchase. So is the brand the same kind of sadness in it? This is not necessarily the question that raising that, but it's one to have the same sadness in it. And I want to say two things on that. One, I want to note that I made a point of trying to bring up Barack Obama pretty quickly after talking about the tragedy and violence in icons. And I have written about this too. I think obviously this could be a point of debate depending on your own politics, your own perception of his pre-election person. But I think my own opinion would be pretty hard to say that Barack Obama had done much leadership before he took public office. He had been for a pretty short time a state legislator, and then also a very short time a senator from Illinois. He had, however, spent quite a bit of time thinking about his own life story, and had done that through both service to community and also the creation of a memoir and another one he wrote in the plot towards his campaign. So his story of his own particular struggle was so essential, if you remember, to his campaigning sale. He was all of us. He had all of us inside of us. And I think he would be the first person, he has nearly said it in many interviews without leaping over. I became an emblem for all of you, and then you wanted me to come and wheedle Congress? Well, first of all, he was not particularly talented in that language of politics, but also what does it mean to ask of a person to be both an icon of a history of violence and its triumph, and then, as Tracy said, well, the sort of plot of progress from that. What would it look like for Obama to have done that? I think what I'm trying to say is that leadership requires the losing of yourself. The greatest image to me of this was as LBJ, who is a person who, again, depending on your politics, you may disagree with his accomplishments, but was very legislatively effective while he was in office, and was a person who functioned as a basic, I'd say, locker room brawler towards the people that he worked with. And he did that often without worrying about how he sounded, how he looked. There was no desire to keep maintaining an image of him in public life other than being the guy who was cutting the deals to make a good life for the common man, whether or not you agree with those deals. So I think the question, to me, leadership is some form of that, and I think the question of how we live now in a time that's so totally determined by these brands to which, when you see the image of Guevara's face made up of brands, we can say that is someone commenting on the fact that even Guevara himself has no meaning to the people who follow him anymore. He's been lost, he's been vacated of all his substance. But also the way in which we, too, have become so comprised of our brands. And it seems about 10 or 15 years ago, we stopped trying to care. I always like to place it at the death of Kurt Cobain. After Kurt Cobain, nobody cared anymore whether or not Target was bad, Target was in. And I think the question of whether or not we want to resist the frame, so to me, that is a sadness. Brands are a kind of ironic, and I think to me, that's, I'll just say this final point and I'll stop talking, which is Kanye's genius, which I do think he is genius, debate. His genius is that he knows that. He has an incredibly feeling understanding of capitalism and its takeover of the human self, the history of capitalism and the commodification of the individual body. And he says to all that, I'm your Hermes, and makes his very black body subject for your purchase. And then partners with the most commodified body in the West. The guy's evil genius. So he will be the icon for the next people to look at. I don't actually think he'll be an icon in the same way. His face won't be, he won't have the same carriage that these figures, he has something else. He's more in the line of the kind of figures that we're all writing about, which is these sort of cultural icons, creators, thinkers, but I don't think they'll carry that same repository of people who lean into him for the feeling that he expresses and redacts them. He is a critic. He is a person tormenting people with his words, if you take the time to listen to his dark, dark lyrics. But hello, yes.
So I noticed when you were showing us pictures of different religious figures of the 20th century and modern day, you didn't show Pope Francis.
I did not.
I thought it was interesting.
I did not.
He was Time Person of the Year 2000.
I know it, yes.
He was, I think he's the definition of a celebrity.
Yes, he is. You are right, yes.
And talking openly about homosexuality, increasing the role of women in the church.
Yeah.
Could you just touch a little bit on how his role as a celebrity sort of promoted his leadership style?
Yeah. He is brilliant, man. I mean, is there anyone here who has not thought, you are good at your job? You have learned something. And what I mean by that is something not entirely happy. I know many people who are more invested in the plots of Catholicism. Perhaps some of you are. So I will just reflect some of the things that those people have said and then speak to. So the first thing I would say in response to your question, from my idiom, of which I am more ignorant of the function of the cardinals and whether or not, because I always want to differentiate. The public likes Francis. We like Francis. And I think there's a demography of Catholics who are generally happy and like Francis. The talk really was trying to focus on was the difficulty of being an ecclesiastical leader, which the Pope, we could say a long time ago, stopped being and became this other emblem. I would date it at the 50s. There's other people in the room who might want to say, when did the Pope supersede and become conceivable as someone who could be a spiritual leader for more than just Catholics? Anyone you want to? What did you say? Did you give a date? Yes, exactly. So he could have the capacity. Most of them didn't become it, right? If I popped up Pope John Paul, some of you who were alive then would know it, but very few people among the vast secular public thought, he's my guy, I follow him into fire. So Pope Francis, on the other hand, kind of vast secular public, are so psyched because he's finally mentioning a bunch of human beings he didn't mention. To me, his iconicity is going to be interesting to see if his face will be perpetual in the way that Mother Teresa is. So I could have put a bunch of different nuns up there, and I put up Mother Teresa, you know her. If I put up a bunch of different popes, most of you would recognize Francis because he was on magazines. I'm wondering if 50 years from now his face will still be imprinted. The question of the carriage of the office, the particularity of the person, this is what I'm saying in a very messy way, is I think time will tell, because to me the weight of ecclesiastical history is upon Francis. How far can he go beyond the idiom of a mediated age he is clearly a master of? Is that going to be, it'll be interesting to see the expansive power of that pulpit, because he's still dealing with an incredibly complicated, and I'll use a bad word, Byzantine church structure that will not necessarily allow him some of the edges of freedom he's articulated in word. But it will make a lot of us feel good again about Catholicism, and will bring back some people who felt pretty bruised by the previous 15 years of dark, dark Catholic history. But will that enliven the worship? So I'm trying to separate out here the question of, can an ecclesiastical leader become transcendent of ecclesiastical power? I myself, I'll be interested to watch it. He's an interesting case. But I didn't put him up because in some ways he was too easy, and I wanted to put more absurd people up. And I wanted to get Bono up there. I mean, I'll be frank. So I had priorities, but I appreciate it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Yeah, a great example of an icon is Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
Everywhere you go in the country, you see her face on everything.
Yes.
Flags, stickers, pins, posters. Whereas 2 years ago, it was illegal.
Yeah.
You would be put in jail if it was forbidden. So now it's everywhere. But like you said, leaders have a harder time than icons because they need to listen and hear.
Yeah.
So now she is in legislature,
Yeah.
and her favorables are falling both with the elite and the people, because she does not quite have a high pedestal anymore, and leaders need to compromise and icons don't.
Yeah.
And she's also a picture of sadness because her father was assassinated when she was 3 years old, and he was the liberator of the country. So she's kind of a perfect example of a living icon become leader, and they want her to remain an icon on that pedestal. Not possible when
Yeah.
in the General Assembly.
No, I appreciate that, and that's one of the things that I had a version of this that included basically a very gloomy list of founders of nations who really were disastrous as leaders of those nations. And she, you could say, is a new incarnation of her nation, and is obviously a person that around the world, like the Dalai Lama, you may not know the particulars, what was wrong with Burma, what's going on in Tibet, but you know that person has persevered in some concept of oppression. But then what are the ways out of deconstructing that legacy, that history of trauma that she is now going to try to preside over its reconciliation? We lost Nelson Mandela, and in that wake of his death, there were so many treatments of the contemporary South Africa and its ongoing facing of problems. And if there is any takeaway from my own work here today, I suppose I want to thank you for giving that example and actually speaking about it so well. But also to think about what our role is as consumers of our leaders, that we are so impatient with those transactions between the necessary rhetoric and poetry of campaigning and of revolution and of revival, and then the real hardtack banality of bureaucratization and politics. And how do we imagine re-educating a public to conceive of that? One of the things I would just note is it seems to me that especially as individuals become more and more responsible for their own bureaucratic self-management, whether it's our health care or our retirement packages. My mother came of age and retired, never having to think about her retirement once. And maybe there's many of you in the audience like that, where it was just not a question. She was going to finish working and the federal government was going to pay her the rest of her life her decent middle-class salary. And now we're all strategists of our own self-occupation. We become, in some ways, our own little leaders of nations, our managers of these little projects, the survival of our mechanical and material selves in perpetuity. No wonder, then, that we lean into Beyoncé, who never has to do a thing but be on that pedestal for us. And so I worry about the distraction of such iconography, even as I may take pleasure in it, because it seems so profoundly cruel to the real heroic and needful labor of managing well the states that all of us do compromise as communities together. And now I feel pretty confident that I'm into some idea of like the cyborg brain that's going to take over all of us. So let's go into drinking and celebration with that image of how we can become a hive together, creating our own new common purpose. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.